the major impact of it in Denmark was because when we did the Panama Papers in Politiken and in DR Documantry, it made the financial authorities in Denmark investigate the 8 largest banks in Denmark for businesses like this. And a year after, they made a report saying that all these 8 banks had businesses like Nordea, helping their wealthy client, hiding their money for all kinds of reasons. And I think it sort of raised the alertness of the banks, the role of the banks in this shady business.
It's very soon 2 years ago since the first Panama Papers story got published. Alex, when did you get the idea to make this movie about it, and why?
Well, I obviously was not privy to the leak before the leak. I'd been following offshore stories, and there had been several big offshore stories that preceded the Panama Papers leak, which some of these guys worked on as well. And I was interested in, I've done other stories around the aspects of the information age that have to do with transparency and whistleblowers and digital communities and networks. And it was interesting to me how you had a sort of global, vast global, largely internet-based network, which is how Mossack Fonseca was, like every business, was largely integrated and servicing their clients, which is why you were able to have a whistleblower like Doe pull all of the data in one fell swoop. And then you had, on the other hand, you had all these journalists who had their own internet-based network to combat that. So it's a very modern day story in that way, but it's not in a superficial way. It actually has huge implications on how we function as a global society moving forward, both for ill and for good. So I was tracking the story, so when it broke, I was immediately interested in trying to dive in and get sort of the heart of how the story was covered by all these journalists and broken. And then because of when I came on, there were still aspects of the story that were still, the story's ongoing to this day, obviously, but I was only about halfway through shooting when, for instance, when Daphne was assassinated. I was in England at that time, and there were aspects of the story that we had to stay on top of to sort of shape before we were able to come out. So it was somewhat of a retrospective story, somewhat of usual documentary bloodhound, bothering all of your subjects for media all the time and cobbling together a kind of a landscape, a picture of what's going on the ground, with all of the on-the-ground work that we did. We traveled the world for 2 years on this and then the ongoing story.
On your website, you write that that the project had to be entirely secret. Why was that?
Well, it's there's a couple of reasons why. What we do, what I do when I'm telling a story like this is I immediately fan out to all the sources that I can get to, and you're protecting your subjects and their work. You're protecting your crew. Obviously, we're shooting in a lot of countries and pursuing a story that they didn't want to have any further exposure. So they weren't particularly happy to see us. So you're also just in a very practical way concerned about your media, just being able to get wasn't necessarily worried about my safety, though I was cautious. I was mostly concerned about having our media protected. So all your media is encrypted, you're not doing lots of publicity, you're not talking about the project. That's largely to protect your actual content so that it isn't hacked or stolen, or that you're not shut down. I've had that happen on other projects where you have sort of legal pressure, even if it's coming from a nefarious place, to try to get you to stop doing what you're doing. And I didn't want any of that, so we just stayed completely under the radar. We didn't talk about the film at all until it was completely finished.
And you succeed about that, or did you get any threats?
No, we stayed. We were blacked out. We were 100% off the radar.
Yeah.
Nobody knew what we were doing until we were done.
Bastian, you were the one who got contacted by John Doe, you shared all these files. Can you tell a bit about that process before you decided that you had to?
They thought I'm really crazy because we had that huge scoop. At least it looked like it was way smaller than it was in the end. It was maybe 100 gigabytes or something, so really small. But they said, why should we share it? Why should we give it away? And we tried to explain that we worked with the ICRJ before, and now we want to give back the favor that we had gotten when we were on the receiving side of like Swiss leaks and offshore leaks. And that was a little helping, but in the end, we could explain them that, you know, if we don't share, we get all the attention. So if you look at it like there's one cake of attention, we would have gotten the whole cake for Süddeutsche Zeitung. But once we shared it, and it was now in more than 100 media, the cake was so big that our share, which was smaller relatively, was way bigger than the whole cake before, if that makes sense. Anyway, so they understood, and then aside from that, we told them about the biggest stories that we had found so far. The Russian story about the best friend of Vladimir Putin, a cello player who was in the mid of billion circulating around him, and the then sitting Prime Minister of Iceland. We had no one in our team that spoke Icelandic, no one spoke Russian. We had no clue, we needed help, we needed to partner up, and it was just too big for us alone.
In the film you tell that you are a bit nervous before all the journalists. John, for instance, are coming to Munich for the first meeting you have together. John, do you remember what did you expect before that meeting?
I didn't expect what I was seeing when I arrived there, because I had been in on 2 or 3 ICIJ projects before, and we had been, I guess, some 25 or 30 media, mostly from Europe. And here, I think we were more than 100 reporters from Africa, from South America, from China, from Asia at least, all over the world. And my first thought was, we are never going to keep this secret for another, because that was in September in 2015, and we were not going to publish before April of 2016. And we told each other those stories about Dugin, Putin's best friend, about the Icelandic Prime Minister. Everybody revealed their best findings so far, and everybody kept secret. It was fantastic. It was like I joined a radio show when we had published Panama Papers, and I told him how we cooperated and how we managed to keep it all secret. And he said afterwards, he said, "You make journalism sound beautiful." And I think he was right.
What was the biggest challenge in that big collaboration that you had?
Well, there were actually many challenges. One big challenge was the data, because it kept growing and kept growing. I received more than a year data, and I had times when I was really praying that there weren't more to come.
No more John Doe.
No more data. Because I'm not a data nerd, I don't know how to handle all this. I lose very small passwords, and now we had those huge passwords with all those complicated numbers and stuff, and I damaged 3 external hard drives. That's very easy, you only have to let it fall from this height. It's going to be damaged, I don't know why. So I was always afraid of losing what we had, the data, so I was doing safety copies all the time. In my living room was always like 3 laptops and external hard drives, copying from one to the other. And I was completely, there was way over my head. So then we hired a data journalist, and this front was getting better. And then we had 400 colleagues in the world working with us, and everyone was a danger for my whistleblower, because his or her life was at stake. and was a danger for the whole investigation. If one of them would have not kept silent, the whole thing would have gone to pieces. And then you have to deal. I mean, if you know one journalist, you probably know someone with a big ego, know it all, you know, and we had 400 of them. And we had to speak about on which day should we publish. And we were 100 people in that room, and we had to agree on one day. And the irony was, finally we agreed on one day. It was March 16th, something like that. And like 4 weeks later, I spoke to my editor, and he said, we got 3 regional elections on that day. You won't get the front page. And we were like, okay, maybe we should find another day. It was my fault, our fault, because we looked, you know, around the world, what are the big events on that day, but we didn't look to Germany. It seems very strange, but it was a very strange phase in my life.
Maybe you remember, Bastian, that first we landed on the 8th of March.
Yeah.
But then the Russians said, no.
Women's Day.
And everybody in Russia gets pissed.
And finally we said, you know, someone, you know, we can't save like everybody in our team. So when we finally published, there was, I think, the president's elections in Peru or something. So one of us had to have the bad side of it. But it was really hard. Also, we had real substantial fights on when to get to the customers, when to approach the people we want to write about. I mean, we had the Danish colleagues said we need at least 2 months. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, for the documentary.
Yeah, the documentary. So, and the Russians said, if you give them more than a week, then we're not going to be there anymore, you know, the day we publish, because they're going to close down our paper. So, and we were in the middle of that. We said, okay, what are we going to do? What they expect us to do? And we're so thankful that we had the ICRJ guys who managed all that. Marina Walker, who was the living shepherd of those 400 colleagues. So it was really hard work, and to find a compromise on the next one and the next one. And we were really happy when this was over.
How did you decide on who should take contact to, you took contact to Putin, for instance, and David Cameron and all the big fish? How did you organize that?
So mostly it works like you go to them if it's your country.
Yeah.
So, but in the case of Putin, the Russians said maybe it's not a good idea. So we were like shopping around. Yeah, exactly. And then the BBC said, well, legal issues, and the Guardian said, well, we have a bad libel law in the UK, and then it got stuck on the desk of my colleague Frederick. So he sent the email. And we visited Moscow last year, Russia, to make an interview with Snowden, and we were allowed in and allowed out again. But we weren't sure about that because of this email, and maybe also the story. So we had the yes from Snowden for 4 months, and then we finally we thought maybe we shouldn't go. It's maybe not a good idea. It's not an investigation. It's only entertainment, only an interview. But then we agreed we're going to fly there on the day the World Championship would start. So football, because the last thing they wanted on this day is 2 investigative journalists being jailed in Russia. That would be really bad news for them. So we flew in only for the interview. We brought our own food and water. Maybe a little over the top, and may admit that. And we flew back the next day. And yeah, that was. But it really felt strange to go there after the Rolugin story and the way how Mr. Putin had reacted, and he accused us that Süddeutsche Zeitung was being owned by a US bank, which, you know, he meant to say by Jews, which is not right. It wouldn't be a problem, but it's not like it is. And so they really attacked us, and yeah. felt strange, because usually we don't have to mess with guys like him.
At one point, John Doe asked you whether you are afraid. You know, you write him if he or she or they are afraid, and then he or she or they write back whether you are, because you will be on the byline and stuff. Were you ever afraid during the process, being in the middle of this whole investigation?
Well, it felt strange, that I have to say, because we found the money of Putin and dictators, and many bad guys and mafia clans and whatever. But it felt like the big risk is always for the ones who take it in their respective countries, who sign the name. So you would have to go, for example, in the case of Russia, you would have to say, okay, Romananin is fighting in Novaya Gazeta. Where did he get information from? This ICIJ in Washington, this is CIA, bad people. But where did they get information from? Süddeutsche Zeitung, Süddeutsche what? This is a paper in Germany, and then who's it? So it's a long way to go. So we didn't felt really. So we knew there's a chance, and we took some safety measures and all that. But I don't really thought that the chances are high, which is not helpful for your family if you say it's not likely. But that's how we dealt with it, because we went in too deep when we realized that it really could be dangerous. But I'm now saying all this because we acted in 2016. If we would have had to make this decision now, after Daphne Caruana Galizia has been murdered, and Jan Kuciak in Slovakia has been shot, and his fiancée, I would not be as easy with that. So maybe we would have decided not to go with our names or whatever. But back then it felt like if you're an investigative journalist in the European Union, you are safe. No discussion, no dispute. And that has changed. So I think, I don't know what we would do now, but we would feel much less safe than we did.
Okay, before you can ask a few questions, I will just we'll take a brief look at what the status is now. We talked about it out back. For instance, how you told us, Bastian and John, what about the taxes being paid back from all this investigation that the authorities have done since you published?
Well, we'll have a number by the end of the week probably, because of the third anniversary, and it's probably been more than $1 billion that are being recouped by authorities around the world, because they acted after the Panama Papers, and it's still ongoing and still growing. And we had a raid at Deutsche Bank end of last year, because of the Panama Papers, and we had indictments in the US in December. So there are still things happening. It's not number one, obviously, on the news agenda, and we are not, working with the data all day, but we are all using it still for a lot of financial investigations, because there is so much data in it that we haven't even looked at it, and so many people use offshore companies for illicit gains, for money they don't want someone to know where they got it from, and maybe it wasn't yet of interest 3 years ago, and maybe it's now. So we'll keep using it the next years, and we'll see what comes from it.
Yeah, that's the thing, is it's not, the numbers are important, obviously, and it's an easy way for people to wrap their heads around it, but we were talking about this earlier, but it's largely a cultural shift. There's a lot of the significance, and there is huge significance in terms of change and the beginning of change, and the sort of the more of a global understanding of the need for change in these areas, legislation and greater transparency, and the UK is taking steps towards that, and there's more of a groundswell in the US to take steps towards that, especially with Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, and the sort of terrible mechanisms they have in place there. But there's a greater cultural understanding of how to we were talking about this, how to attack these types of stories now, and that I think can really promote great change. That in some ways may be one of the most significant results of this story and the success of this story.
Yes, any questions? We have one down here.
Hi, it's an honor to get to talk to all three of you. This is a question for all three of you, but I guess mostly for Bastian. How has this mind-boggling, massive case, I guess, how has it changed you as a person? Has it changed you? Has it changed how you interact with other people, how you think about life and government and banks and...
That's a lot. But I never sat on stages like that before. So obviously it changed my whole life and the way we did our journalism, because we didn't have all those opportunities before. Now we have friends and colleagues in more than 100 countries that we trust, and when we can't follow a lead, in Germany because it's going to Denmark, I can call John, and if it's going to Uruguay, I can call whoever was our partner. Forgot the name. It's embarrassing. And of course, my private life. Not going to go to Panama or Russia if I don't have the World Cup, and a number of other countries. And it's like, I mean, I learned a lot when I was working with those guys. I was just starting out as an investigative reporter in a way. I was doing it for 4 or 5 years. I worked with colleagues who did the same for 20 years, for 30 years, and you could learn a lot with them. And when with governments and banks, it's just very depressing, because you might think there are many who would stick to the rules, and if you look inside the data, I mean, we had only one law firm from many who did this around the world, and we had leads to more than 70 heads of states. We had 13 by name as clients of Mossack Fonseca involved. And this is only one law firm, so this is ridiculous. So that I don't really want to know how many more are with all the other firms that are still active and still working. And so I think it's not that it's not, if you're working as an investigative journalist, you don't get really depressed. It's like a hunt. You get addicted. You want to get more, and you want to have more. You want to have a better story. But if you are talking with your friends, then very often you aren't too depressed that all of this is still ongoing. And I'm not really, because we need stuff to write about.
I think it changed me a little bit as a journalist, because the principle of how we work in the ICIJ is a principle called radical sharing, which means that you actually share everything, which is very unuseful for most journalists, because what we used to do is to keep our secrets for ourselves until we publish. So you had to sort of get used to it. But once you got used to it, you really saw the qualities of it, how much you could do if you sort of brought all the pieces together from Denmark and Sweden and Norway and Germany and Russia and the UK. So it was really mind-blowing. And the other side of it was that there was an American sociologist working on the Copenhagen Business School, who wrote a book. Her name is Brooke Harrington. She wrote a book about this parallel world where people who had enough money, they're living in a world of their own, where they don't have to abide by the rules we abide by. And this was sort of a documentation that she was right. There is another world which we are not allowed into, and they don't want us to know about it. I think that was the really great perspective of this story.
Yeah, I know that for myself, I made sure that I had subjects lay this out in the film. It's one of the manipulative aspects of making docs, is you find someone who speaks your side of the story in there. But it was really that light bulb moment. John just spoke to it, but it's the more I dug into the story, the more people I met, and then the more people that I met on the other side as well, and heard sort of the excuses for why it was, they called it tax strategizing. It had all kinds of fairly ludicrous justifications for it. But it was that light bulb moment of doing this exploration, and I think that's what I like about documentaries in some cases, where there's sort of a greater depth of understanding that you can get from something that may already be out in the open. And so for me, I knew about offshore, and I knew sort of about systemic corruption, things like that. But this notion of there being really a systematic mechanism that almost created its own economy, that almost ran an economy of its own. And sort of to John's point, it was the kind of the double whammy of, okay, there's a whole world of people out there who have their own secret environment, their own sort of enclosed ecosystem. But the real light bulb moment for me was understanding the implications of that on the average person, that the fuel that powers that other world is everyone else, right? They're not just their own little, we can't just send them out on a barge and forget about them. The fuel that drives that other ecosystem is everyone else and all of our resources. And that I did not fully understand until I got knee deep into the story, and that's really, I think, why the story is so important.
I mean, there are so many aspects, and we also had a lot of disputes about that. For my part, I was very much against of having more than 200 on board, because I thought it's already not really controllable anymore, and so we should stop there. But the ICRJ, they said, no, we have so many really important stories in this country and that country, we can't omit them. And they were right, looked back, but we also were really lucky that nothing happened and that it all worked out. And so the model that we used to do is we used to try to have a really good partner in a certain country, and maybe a second partner who is not the competition, because it's maybe like a paper and a TV channel or something like that. So they would really work together well, and also had a little bit of control. No one could hide a story or could make it bigger as it was, because the other one would say, hey, what are you doing there? It's not right. But then you need luck. You need someone who would introduce some colleague who would say, I know someone in Iceland who is really good and who are really to trust, and then you would ask around, and you would have another one who says, yeah, this Johannes guy is really good, but is he really? We didn't know. So yeah, it's been a risk, and I think you have to be very careful. And I know that it's now very modern to work in big international collaborations, but we should only really do it, I think, if it makes sense. Because also what it does, it gives your story a huge importance. So if you have a mediocre story that's not really a big story, and you're working with 500 colleagues in 90 countries, then it must be very important. And in the end, this can really shoot backwards. Because if it's not important, it's just, it's gonna sink. You don't have the audience, people won't listen, and they won't believe you the next time when you're saying, this is a big story, we needed a lot of colleagues. I think you have to be very careful.
I think it's definitely not a dying art. Not in Denmark at least, because, a lot of media companies are struggling to find a way to a new business model, of course, but there's no doubt that there are more investigative and more good investigative reporters in Denmark now than there was 10 years ago. We can see that every year when we, in the Investigative Journalists Federation in Denmark, the FVJ, we hand out prizes every year. And I think the field of stories being nominated there is getting being more of them each year, and they're getting better each year. So I'm very optimistic, and I think it's one of the ways that real media, quality media, can sort of make sense of why we have to be there.
What you do.